I know you have other speakers who are going to go on to this particular issue far more eloquently than I, and I yield back to the gentleman from Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Next, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from South Carolina, District 3, Jeff Duncan. And I yield to him as much time as he may consume.
Thank you. You know, as a new congressman back in January, I was never prouder than when I took this floor to take part in reading the United States Constitution. That day, I brought with me to the podium a copy of the Constitution that I carry in my pocket every day. Ronald Reagan, in his farewell address to the American people in January of 1989, said this: "Ours was the first revolution in the history of mankind that truly reversed the course of government, and with three little words, we the people." We tell the government what to do, President Reagan stated. It does not tell us. A simple phrase, we the people, put down by our founding fathers who defined self-government. Self-government. Those words ring true. I think daily about that government that they formed. A limited government, one with powers for each branch that are clearly spelled out in this document, clearly defined. And you know, we're a long ways from the limited government and the limited and enumerated powers that they strive to corral. I'm concerned that we don't read and study the United States Constitution enough in our public schools like we used to when I grew up. I'm worried that we, the people, don't know or remember why our founding fathers divided power into three separate branches of government, why they defined the powers of each, and why they were inclined to spell out our liberties in a Bill of Rights. You know, they formed this government that's lasted well over 200 years. But after they formed that government, they decided that they better spell out the liberties. In fact, they had to do that in order to have the states ratify this great document. Everywhere I travel around my beloved Palmetto State and around this country, I ask folks, what are your First Amendment rights? And almost to a person, they mostly answer freedom of speech. But you know, let me remind you here today that the first thing our founding fathers addressed was your freedom of religion. In fact, the first sentence in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution says this. It says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof." They do that before they address your freedom of speech, before they address your freedom of the press, before they address your right to peacefully assemble or your right to petition this government for redress of grievances. Folks, I remind you that our freedoms are slowly being eroded in this country, and I believe that we as Americans need to get back to doing what we did in that first week in this United States Congress, and that's take this document out, read it, understand what our founding fathers were trying to do when they said, we the people will govern ourselves. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Very eloquently said. And I would like to just touch on a couple of things that Mr. Duncan mentioned, Mr. Speaker. As we did have the great opportunity to read the Constitution on the House floor, I found it not only to be one that should be a lesson for all of us, but also one that will remind each American the great document that we have that governs our land. And I'd like to read just a couple of statements that some of our founding fathers made that I believe are so important for each one of us to remember today. I'd like to first of all start with George Washington, who is my political hero, the great men that not only was so willing to sacrifice and was willing to serve his great country for, he could have been king if he was wanting to, but instead knew that limited power was going to be the real answer to America's new Constitution and to its new government. I'd like to read this. The power under the George Washington, quote, "The power under the Constitution will always be in the people. It is entrusted for certain defined purposes and for a certain limited period, to representatives of their own choosing, and whenever it is executed contrary to their interest or not agreeable to their wishes, their servants can and undoubtedly will be recalled," end quote. And Mr. Washington was referring to elections, and I think that what has not only solidified our government for years and years has been that it is the people's government. This is the people have the ability to recall those who are elected to go to their respective capitals, whether it's in the state governments or whether it's in here in Washington, D.C., and if their wishes are not received by the people can recall them back to their states and elect someone new. Also, I'd like to read another statement by Thomas Jefferson, quote, "On every question of construction, let us carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or invented against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed." Thomas Jefferson was our third president and was one of the great men who was a part of and building our great democracy and our republic here in the great country of the United States. I would also like to refer a little bit to my time in having the opportunity to serve in the Indiana State Legislature and knowing that Thomas Jefferson was a Federalist and believed that in states' rights. And one of the things that I have seen in my short time in Washington is that the states have so much flexibility and have so much more ability to serve the people as well as our local governments. And that is one of the reasons that I believe the Constitution was formed, was to protect that local control. As we've seen time and time again, there is more influence by our federal government in reaching further and further into our communities with more mandates, with more legislation that continues to take away our freedoms. And having the opportunity to serve in the state legislature in Indiana, I would also share that we can see how each state has different needs. And the Constitution addresses that by limiting the powers of the federal government. And we're seeing more and more waste of tax dollars, one that I believe that the American people are tired of, and they want to see Washington fix its problems just like the American people do every day in tightening their own belt. We tighten our belt in our small family farming operation back in Indiana. We do that with our family budget. And, you know, people are asking across the country, well, if we can do it, why can't Washington? And we're seeing overlap of federal and state government and local government. And I believe that if we would get back to the constitutional roles, the constitutional role that the federal government is given, and focus on the priorities that our founding fathers gave to us in the Constitution as a government, then we will be more effective. We will serve the people who have elected us to serve. And instead of infringing upon the responsibilities and the rights of those in our states, that we will have a more efficient government, and we will also have a government that is closer to the people, and one that I believe serves best when government is close to the people. It will serve and respond to the needs of them. I believe at this time I'd like to yield to a gentleman from Texas, Mr. Conaway. Thank you for being here, and looking forward to your comments.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. I appreciate being here to participate in the Constitution Caucus's comments on our Constitution. We labor under the sometimes, or mostly all times, misguided idea that we're the smartest people who ever walked the face of the earth, and that no new ideas are created except through us. And sometimes it's helpful to look back at some of the things folks who've gone on before us have said, and to help us reflect on those and see how they apply to today's circumstances. A couple of those things. One is from a speech that Robert Kennedy made on the Day of Affirmation address that he did in South Africa back in 1966. And while much of what he talked about, the revolution of youth and the civil rights movement and other things are not germane to what we're talking about tonight, there is a section that is particularly relevant to this conversation, and I would like to read into the record his comments some of those early paragraphs. He started off by saying, we stand here in the name of freedom. Freedom is that wonderful word that conjures up inside of all of us those kinds of feelings that are unique to just certain words. Liberty is another word that does that. It has that kind of visceral experience inside each one of us. It's different, but nonetheless inspiring almost every single time you hear that. Kennedy went on to say, at the heart of that Western freedom and democracy is the belief that the individual man, the child of God, is a touchstone of value, and all societies, groups, the state, exist for his benefit. Therefore, the enlargement of liberty for individual human beings must be the supreme goal in the abiding practice of any Western society. The first element of this individual liberty is the freedom of speech, the right to express and communicate ideas, to set oneself apart from the dumb beasts of the field and the forest, to recall governments to their duties and obligations. Above all, the right to affirm one's membership and allegiance to the body politic and to society, to men with whom we share land, our heritage, and our children's future. The essential humanity of men can be protected and preserved only where government must answer, not just to the wealthy, not just to those of a particular religion or a particular race, but to all people. And even government, by the consent of the governed, as in our Constitution, must be limited in its power to act against its people, so that there may be no interference with the right to worship or with the security of the home, no arbitrary imposition of pains and penalties by high officials or low, no restrictions on the freedom of men to seek education or work or opportunity of any kind, so that each man may become all he is capable of becoming. These are the sacred rights of Western society. Senator Kennedy got it right. These are the sacred rights of Western society, and we are in danger of having those rights trampled on by this continued growth in the size of our federal government. If you look at the trajectory that we find ourselves on from a financial standpoint, you can have estimates by think tanks on the left, estimates by think tanks on the right, the CBO, the GAO, all of these have 75-plus year projections of the path that we are currently on. If you stack each of those projections on a light table to look through all of them at the same time, there's not a chigger's whisker difference between the path that we're on. Nobody disagrees that the path that we're on is absolutely unsustainable. I tell my constituents back home, we're very much like the fellow who fell off the 10-story building. As he passed the 5th floor, he said, so far so good, so far so good. Well, we are that guy. And although our financial wreck is 10, 15, 20 years down the road, we are in a free fall that has an abrupt, immediate stop somewhere in our future. We are bright, intelligent, smart, individual people, present company accepted. We ought to be able to look at those projections, Mr. Speaker, and take action. We have for 5 years now, 6 years this summer, August, failed to reform Social Security. When I first joined Congress in 2005, that was one of the leading issues on our table at that time. And yes, we got distracted with whether or not part of it should be personally owned and part of it should not. But at the end of the day, we had a predicate, set the predicate for why Social Security needed to be adjusted. Most of us spent that first 8 months of 2005 trying to lay out to our constituents exactly what the issues were that are familiar with all of us in this chamber. That lasted until the end of August 2005, and then Hurricane Katrina happened and distracted us from the goal of getting it done, and we've not touched Social Security since. We've continued to choose each and every year to not adjust and not renegotiate Social Security. That choice has a consequence, and the consequence is that we're adding about $600 billion of unfunded mandates to the debt of future generations of Americans because we choose not to take action. That choice is ours to take. It is our freedoms to take that choice. It's our liberty to take that choice. But collectively, both sides of the aisle, this isn't a Republican issue or a Democrat issue, both sides of the aisle have, for good or for bad, I would argue for ill, chosen to not address a fundamental spending issue that's among those that we have to face, I would argue, is the least difficult. Let me finish with a quote from George Washington in his first inaugural address. George Washington declared, "The preservation of the sacred fire of liberty, the destiny of the Republican model of government, are finally staked on the experiment and trusted to the hands of the American people. Trust is placed in the people precisely because they are, in the words of the Declaration, equally created and endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. We have that precious gift in our hands. Those of us, the 435 of us who get to vote in this House, the 100 on the other side of this building who get to vote, the man and woman who occupies 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, we have the tools of choice in our hands. Do we choose to preserve liberty and freedom for future generations, or do we choose to continue, as that fellow falling off the 10-story building said, so far so good, so far so good? I argue that we should not. I argue that let's use our intellect, let's use our will, let's use the wisdom of the American people who last November made a pretty dramatic statement as to what they thought we ought to do. We now need to take those reins of choice in our hands and lead this nation to a sustainable federal government that does not mortgage our grandchildren's future, does not hand off to them an America that is less prosperous, with less opportunity for standard of living increases that you and I enjoyed as we stepped into adulthood. If we choose to continue to ignore the problem and stick our head in the sand, as the ostrich sometimes does, pretty unflattering position, quite frankly, for any of us, including the ostrich, if we choose to do that, then future generations will simply say, why did they do that? They saw it coming. They understood the consequences. They had within their power the ability to make it different. And we have chosen so far to not do that. We have chosen so far to expand federal government at an unprecedented rate. We have chosen to take away from states the rights to conduct those affairs of our individual lives that are properly left to the states and to our local governments, or quite frankly left to us alone as individuals. We have chosen as a federal government, as a nation, to empower this federal government year in and year out to take away our freedoms and our liberties. All I can say to that, Mr. Speaker, is shame on us. Shame on us if we don't right this ship of state by shrinking the size of this government, limiting what it does in our day-to-day lives, getting back to the fundamental founding principles that our founding fathers built this country on, and that is a limited federal government with limited powers, everything else being reserved to the states and or local municipalities, or not at all, and left to the people. So, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the opportunity to express these comments tonight, and I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to yield again to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett.
And again, I thank the gentleman from Indiana for hosting tonight's special order dealing with the Constitution, and more specifically, tonight we spent a little time talking about, as the previous gentleman just did, on limited government and its role in protecting human dignity. Now, the gentleman from Texas was just referencing the issue with regard to the unsustainable projection and trajectory of spending on the federal level, and the burden, therefore, that we place on untold generations that follow after ours. And you have to ask then, what sort of respect does this generation have for the human dignity of future generations who encompass their lives with the specter of having limitations on their ability to make fundamental choices for themselves because of the obligations that have been placed upon them by this generation. You know, earlier I spoke about the divine, and I think you need to do so when you're asking the fundamental question, as we're doing tonight, with regard to the issue of human dignity. And I was quoting, not from myself, but from Lincoln and also from our founding documents, that speak of the divine and named in the Declaration as the laws of nature, the Creator, the supreme judge of the world, the divine providence. In all areas of this, as is set forth in our documents, was talking about in these areas that human dignity comes from not from man themselves, but from creation by the Creator, from the divine. And then it's the imperfect, the man, human beings, who distort that in some way. And government, as I said before, being not perfect and not capable of being perfected, has the obligation to protect human dignity as best it can, but obviously does so in a perfect manner. Now, the gentleman from Utah talked about that it's not just over the recent decades that this has occurred, but it's over the last generations, probably going back over 100 years, he said. Actually, You probably think about it at the beginning of, what, the progressive movement, I guess you would say, here in this country, where there began this distortion of the understanding of the Constitution, and the progressive movement elaborated upon the powers of the federal government to expand in areas that it never was envisioned by our founders. Matter of fact, as I say, talk about the progressive movement, we have a progressive caucus here on the other side of the aisle, I guess, who speaks about these things all the time, but in a much more favorable light than we talk about it from this side of the aisle. So if you go back, let's see, about 80, 90, 100 years in the progressive movement, it began to encroach upon the human being and the rights of man, and basically, therefore, what we're talking about tonight, human dignity, in some very profound and fundamental ways. You know, what are some of the basic issues that a man is able to decide about himself? Well, what he's able to eat, and what he's able to grow to eat. Well, it was a progressive movement, and during the time of Roosevelt that finally said that, you know, the federal government knows better when it comes to what man can eat and what he can grow for himself, and put a limitation on an individual farmer as to what he could grow in his own backyard to sustain himself and his family. And they said no. The federal government said no, we're going to have the long arm of the federal powers of the federal government reach into that farmer's backyard and dictate to him that no, he could not grow those particular crops, even though he was not selling them and they were not in the stream of commerce, and he was not transporting them across state lines, and interstate commerce was not involved whatsoever. But rather, the government said that we, the federal government here in Washington, could constrict him as to the very food that he provides for his own family. Now, fast forward to this generation and this past Congress, well, you see the same sort of thing goes here as far as now not only food and all the regulations that entwine in that area that have grown, and multitude of regulations over the year, and now from food to water, and Washington now dictates your very own water use. And we're all familiar with that infamous decisions with regard to the toilets that you have in your own house and the water consumption that you have. These are not even things that you can decide among yourselves. The government will step in. How about the lights that you turn on? How are you going to illuminate your home so that you can have a light to read your books in the evening? Well, no, the federal government says that is not the province of man. That is the province of the federal governments to dictate as well. So each area, we take one more chip away at individual human dignity as deciding how you can control and live your own life. And Washington is now the arbiter in those things. And now we rise to perhaps one of the most fundamentals after food and water and light, and that's health care. And of course, we saw what happened in the last session of Congress here, where the federal government says that we here, the bureaucrats, the elected officials, the politicians, know better than you as to just what sort of health care you need, what sort of doctor you should see, how often you should go, and all the other myriad decisions that were wrapped up into that semblance of how do I take care of my own human body, how do I take care of my own health decisions. And now, of course, we passed a bill under our objection, of course, on this side of the aisle, but with complete support on the other side of the aisle, and the White House as well, saying no, Washington can now dictate those areas to a point that we have never seen before in the history of this government, in the history of this country, that the price of citizenship is the purchase of a particular product that the federal government bureaucrats dictate. The price of citizenship, the price of freedom, the price of liberty, the price of being an American is now dictated to you by the federal government and bureaucrats here in Washington. They will dictate and control your health care, just as a previous progressive era politician said that they will dictate with regard to the food that you grow and water that you use and the lights that you light, now also in the area of health care as well. So where do we then end up going from all this? Where is the next step? Well, as I said before, government is not perfect. Man cannot be perfected. So we should not look to the government as we said before, the angelic beings that are going to give us all the right rules and regulations in this area. We should not look to the government to provide for us in these respective areas but rather that we are individuals made by our Creator that have our own worth and our own human dignity, and that Washington should not take that away from us. So I'll close where I began some time ago. We will look then not to the imperfect bureaucrats nor the imperfect politicians, but rather the people who inherently have the power to send us here or return us, the people who have the power to create governments or not, and that is the population of this government, population of this country, the citizens of this country, where all power truly emanates from originally. For them to speak up loudly, to have their voices heard, as they did in this past election in November, to make sure that their human dignity is protected, that it is not eroded upon anymore, and that rather that it can grow and prosper and expand as our founding fathers intended, and why they were these rights and limitations on powers were rather so greatly. And that is why, as I said at the beginning, I appreciate so much the gentleman from Indiana for your work in bringing this message here to the floor, to the members that are here, the members that will listen, and to the American public. And I look forward to the further work of you and the rest of the caucus and other members of this conference to expound upon these areas, not only of human dignity, but also of our issues of federalism and protected rights to the states and the individuals as well. And I look forward to those discussions on the floor in the future. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would inquire how much time we have remaining.
Gentleman has 10 minutes remaining.
10 minutes? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd just like to make a couple of comments in closing. I have appreciated the comments that are made by the other gentlemen that were here this evening. You know, one of the things that I believe is that the American people that have been given the rights and the responsibilities to elect those of us who are fortunate enough and honored to come to Washington to serve are paying attention. And they're paying attention to what we are doing in response to the actions that have been taken over the years here in Washington. Washington seems to be the problem. When I go back home to Indiana, I hear repeatedly from folks that, you know, Republican, Democrat, we can point the finger at from side to side, but it's been Washington that's been out of touch with the American people, and that Washington needs to be changed, not necessarily America needing to be changed. And that is what I believe is so important for us as Americans, that we get back to our founding documents, to realize the truths and the principles that are in these documents that our founding fathers wrote over 200-some years ago. And I would like to read just a couple of lines from the Declaration of Independence. As Mr. Garrett was referring to earlier, the freedom and the opportunity that each of us as Americans have is given to us by our Creator, but also the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution give us rights and freedoms as well. I'd like to refer to these lines in the Declaration of Independence. Many of these are obviously very familiar to us, but we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, I would submit, Mr. Speaker, that the people are the ones who are giving us the power to govern, and that the Constitution, as it was written back by our founding fathers, was written in the efforts to protect each individual and to protect each individual freedom that we have and enjoy every day. I would also mention that, as was mentioned before, that it is important for us as Americans to not only take on that personal responsibility, but also to realize that our freedoms are given from our Creator, and that they are also, it's important for each one of us to not only fight to protect those freedoms, but remember some of the words that our founding fathers used as well, going back to what Benjamin Franklin said, and I'd quote, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters," end quote. So it is up to each one of us as Americans, Mr. Speaker, that we are first of all, as individuals and as communities, involved in our communities, whether it's our churches, whether it's our schools, that we are taking on each responsibility and looking around us and who can we help? How can we make a difference in someone else's lives? I'd also read John Adams said this, quote, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other," end quote. And how fortunate we as Americans are to have not only this founding document, but many other founding documents written by men who were given such a great responsibility and a great opportunity to create one of the longest-lasting governments in world's history. And I am so proud to be an American tonight and believe that we have, even though we have many challenges in front of us, we have great debt, we have great deficits, and this is because of the irresponsible actions taken by those in Washington. And I believe that today it is important for each one of us as Americans to refamiliarize, to become more familiar with our Constitution and to read the words, as it may seem sometimes dry and not as exciting. But these documents, this document, these words give each one of us as Americans the opportunity to make life better than what we may have entered. I know for myself as a son of a farmer in northern Indiana, was raised in an old farmhouse, and now I have the great opportunity to serve in Congress, that each one of us can do great things if we set our minds to it. And it's because of this document that gives us that liberty and that freedom. So I have great hope that the American people and that those who are elected to serve will make those choices that will not only continue to grant us those freedoms, but also steer the ship and turn the ship in changing the mindset of Washington and the way that our federal government has responded and acted over the years recently, that will not only give our children and our grandchildren the same opportunities that we have, but to work together across the aisle, knowing that we all serve and have sworn to uphold the Constitution, to make those changes. And I'm optimistic, I'm hopeful, but I know that we have a lot of work ahead. But I believe that the documents that we've been given and that were signed by our founding fathers have given us that guiding light. And I am looking forward to working together with the members in this chamber, both sides of the aisle, to making a difference and to getting back to our constitutional responsibilities. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition?
Make a motion.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I move you that we do now adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
The House is gavelled out, but when members return tomorrow, the Chamber takes up two measures that would end federal mortgage assistance programs. We expect rule debate on both bills to be considered tomorrow afternoon, with votes following that. But earlier in the day, both the House and Senate meet at 11 a.m. Eastern in the House chamber for a joint meeting with Australia's Prime Minister. Follow the House live here on C-SPAN when members return Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern.
You're watching public affairs programming on C-SPAN, created by America's cable TV company.